Hi, everyone. I want to start by saying a big welcome to everyone who's joined today, both fellow Edelman employees and those outside of the organization who've taken the time this evening to join us. You're very welcome. For those who don't know me, I'm Sat Dial. I lead the diversity, equity and inclusion efforts here in London and chair a DEI council across the EMEA region. So look, it's safe to say that COVID has made things challenging and a strange year for us all. As I speak, we're currently about halfway through the second lockdown in the UK. But if the pandemic has allowed for anything positive, it is this space for introspection. We saw this after the horrific murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery, and more recently the shooting of Jacob Blake in the US. As we know, these events are not new. Unfortunately, the list is a lot longer than that, and it's not just across the pond either. We have our own names in the UK. Jimmy Mabengo, Rashan Charles, Sarah Reid, the list goes on. What's new, however, was that everyone suddenly paid attention, and these tragic deaths led to the sudden momentum in the fight against systemic racism. That included us here at Edelman. We did a lot of introspection, had a lot of honest and brave conversations. We acknowledged what needed to be acknowledged, that systemic racism is an issue we must all confront. It exists here in the UK, permeates all aspects of our society, and can be the most insidious in its nature. For many of us, the experience identified gaps in our knowledge. I'm sure conversations we've all had with friends, colleagues, and family have uncovered how much more there is to learn. One of the things we discussed here at Edelman is the role of education, especially of knowing one's history in helping to understand the world around us, including the systemic inequalities that exist. That's why we're here today. We see this session as a stepping stone in the right direction, knowing our history and understanding our present to make change in the future. Now I'm going to pass on to Fatima Qureshi, who will tell you a bit more about the sessions themselves and introduce you to our first in the series, an introduction to Black history with Professor Hakim Adi. Fatima, over to you.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. So I want to start by echoing Sat's welcome to you all. Thank you so much for joining. I'm sure it's going to be a super interesting and enlightening session. I, for one, am definitely going to be paying much more attention than I did back at university in my seminars. For those who don't know me, I'm Fatima Qureshi. I work in the data intelligence team at Edelman, and I work very closely with Sat on a lot of the DEI efforts that we've done in the London office over the past year or so. As Sat's already said, the events sort of earlier in the year prompted a lot of conversations amongst a group of us about what we could do to really help foster some real cultural change at Edelman, specifically around the issue of systemic racism. And a topic that is particularly close to my heart is the erasure of history within our curriculums in the UK. It's something that I believe I've been very conscious of for about 2 decades now, ever since I moved here from Pakistan at the age of 10. When I very quickly realized that despite how intertwined the histories of the two countries are, none of my peers knew that Pakistan even existed. And over time, it's become very clear to me that there's a lot about British history that actually we aren't taught. And I've been reminded again and again about the very real life consequences of that. I know I'm not the only one who thinks it. There's a huge movement in the UK at the moment, largely spearheaded by young people who are fighting against the decolonization of the curriculum and the broader teaching of British history in our schools. It's a movement that speaks to the teaching of more uncensored history, one that doesn't shy away from the uncomfortable truths of our colonial past, but also one that champions and highlights the diversity of contributions to this country of the people from African, Caribbean, South and East Asian backgrounds have made. So we've developed this series, the Hidden Narrative series, with that very particular goal in mind, cognizant of the fact that this is very much a starting point in our journey to truly learn about the past. We are not going to be able to cover everything by any means, but I think it's a huge, huge privilege to be able to share in this experience of learning together and have the opportunity to learn from people who really are experts in their field. So the first of these sessions that we're going to kick off today is about uncovering the hidden narratives of those from African and Caribbean backgrounds with Professor Hakim Adi. He is going to attempt to give us a whistle-stop introductory tour to these histories, which, as we just discussed before we went live, is impossible, but he's going to attempt it. Professor Adi is the first history professor of African heritage who specializes in the history of Africa and the African diaspora. We're so lucky to have him with us today. Before I pass over to him, just a very quick note on logistics. Professor Adi is going to be running the session for the next 35 to 40 minutes, but we'd love for this to be interactive as well. So please do leave comments and questions. You can click the Q&A box to do that. And what we'll do is we'll collect all of those up and get Professor Adi to answer some of those at the end of the session. So my colleagues Maria and Via will be collecting all of those. And that's it from me. So I'm going to pass over to you now, Professor Adi. Take it away. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for that welcome. I just need to be able to share my screen. It takes just a couple of seconds. As you heard, I'm going to attempt to give a history which dates back some few thousand years. I'm actually going to go back 10,000 years from my first slide, just to give perhaps a slightly different view of Britishness. This is one of the first Britons, and this is obviously a reconstruction of what he looked like. He wasn't alone. Everybody else in Britain looked the same way. Everybody in Europe probably looked very, very similar. That is to say, they had dark colored skin, dark hair, and by a strange quirk of genetics, blue eyes. So the first and most ancient Britons that we know about, those who gave their genes to some of those in the modern population, looked something like this. I think if the Immigration Acts and the Home Office had been around 10,000 years ago, they'd probably have stopped this guy and those like him entering the country. But this is what the first Britons looked like. He's often known as Cheddar Man, and his reconstruction is kind of an interesting aspect of Britain's history, because 30 years ago, people have said that Cheddar Man didn't look anything like this, that he had blonde hair and so on and so forth. But the latest scientific techniques have shown us something completely different. Okay, I'm going to move on 10,000 years or so to Roman times, and this is another reconstruction. A woman who's generally known as Ivory Bangle Lady, from her the way she was buried. She was buried with ivory and jade bangles. She would have lived in Roman times about 1700 years ago, something like that. She died in the city of York, and she was interesting in that not only that she came from Africa, she was a young woman when she died, but also so that she was of quite a wealthy background. And she changed people's view, historians' view in particular, of what the African population, or what the British population was like in Roman times. She was not alone. There were many other Africans here, men, women, and children. I think when more research is done, we'll find many more examples like her. We also have to bear in mind that even the rulers of Britain came from Africa in that period. We have a gentleman named Septimius Severus, who was Emperor of Rome and also lived in Britain and died in York, who was from Libya. And there was another gentleman called Quintus Urbicus Lollicus, who was from what is today Algeria in North Africa, who was a Roman governor of Britain. So in Roman times, just like today, the population was extremely diverse. And this population, as I said, were of all social backgrounds, social classes, including some from Africa. Okay, I'm going to move on, 300 years or so to the 7th century. This is an illustration of the, let's see if I can get rid of this. I don't like it. Okay. This is an illustration from a manuscript by Bede, the famous chronicler of Anglo-Saxon times, and it concerns a man called Hadrian, who was, again, another Libyan who came to Britain in that time. He was actually originally intended to be the Archbishop of Canterbury, but he declined that office. But he came and accompanied the new Archbishop. He brought with him learning, books, manuscripts from North Africa. He settled in Canterbury, as you would expect. And he's generally thought as to be responsible for the kind of transformation of the Christian church at that time, for revolutionizing education, the education system, and also contributing to the development of Anglo-Saxon literature. So he's just one example of an African during the Anglo-Saxon period. Again, there are others who we don't know very much about. Skeletons of people who've been discovered who also came from Africa in that period. So we're really at the beginnings of this history in some ways. We need much more investigation to find out exactly what the population was like in that period. Okay, I'm going to move on a few hundred years because of time, and we're going to Tudor times, the times of Henry VII, Henry VIII, Elizabeth I, and so on. And on the right-hand side of this illustration, you can see an African trumpeter. This dates from the first decade of the 16th century, 1507, 1508, something like that. This man's name was John Blank. We know a little bit about him. We know he was a royal trumpeter. We know he's one of the first Africans that we know about who demanded a wage increase and was given a wage increase, but he was just one of hundreds of Africans who were here during that period at the English court, at the Scottish court, and engaged in a variety of occupations in England, from deep sea divers to needle makers. So in Elizabethan times, there was an African population in this country. We don't know that much about them in terms of where they came from. They most likely came from Spain and Portugal. You probably know that in that period, in fact, from the 8th century onwards, parts of Spain and Portugal were occupied by people from North Africa. And it's likely that those Africans who came to Britain in the 16th century probably came from those parts of Europe. Okay, again, we're going to move on to a couple more centuries to a period where Britain's relationship with Africa changed dramatically. And this is the period which is so important in the development of modern Britain, the period of human trafficking and what is often called the slave trade. It's actually obviously an example of human trafficking on a mass scale. Now, this human trafficking from a British point of view also began in the Tudor period, but it really got going in the 17th century, and it was at its height in the 18th century. In the 18th century, Britain was the world's leading human trafficker. And human trafficking in that period, in the 17th century, was conducted very often by royal monopoly companies. All the major monarchs from Elizabeth I to George IV were all involved in human trafficking in some ways, as were the rich and powerful in Britain during that period. And of course, this whole, this great crime against humanity, this human trafficking, produced the wealth which led to the Industrial Revolution in Britain and the development of modern industry and so on and so forth. And there are many examples, too numerous to go into now. So this gentleman was in London in the mid-18th century, about 1750. His name was William Answer. He was the son of a human trafficker from West Africa, and his story tells us something about the relationship between Britain and Africa at that time for those who were rich and powerful in Africa. William's father was, as I said, a human trafficker, a slave trader. He wanted his son to be educated in Britain, as was becoming a tradition for wealthy Africans in that period. He sent him off with a trusted envoy. That person turned out to be not very trustworthy. They kidnapped William, sold him into slavery, and he was taken to Barbados. Eventually, word reached his father, who was, as you can imagine, rather upset about what had happened, and he wrote to his business partners in Britain, the Royal Africa Company, and said, unless my son is returned to me, there'll be no more human trafficking from my part of West Africa. The Royal Africa Company, of course, very concerned about that, immediately sent a delegation to Barbados. They found William. They brought him back to London. They gave him a nice suit of clothes, took him to the opera, took him to the theatre, accommodated him in the house of the president of the Board of Trade, who was the government minister responsible for human trafficking. And after a couple of months, obviously his portrait was painted, he was returned back to his father in West Africa. Father said, great, thanks very much. And now human trafficking can recommence again. So this was how this crime was conducted. And William Answer, just a very interesting example of that process. But of course, for most Africans caught up in it in Britain, it was a very different story. And here we have a young boy. You can see that rather like a dog or a cat, he's wearing a collar. And the fashion at the time, this is probably early 18th century, was for the rich and powerful, like this Duke, to have African boys and girls, sometimes Indian boys and girls, as pets, and to be painted with their pets to show how wealthy they were. And such is the nature of history that we know the name of the Duke, but we don't know the name of this young African. But this was typical 18th century, and a typical 18th century portrait. Here is another example of what went on in Britain at the time, because here we see an auction in a coffee house, and it's a good reminder of the history of coffee houses. To be sold next Tuesday, a Negro, black, African girl, 8 years of age, and so on and so forth. This is not the US, this is not the Caribbean, this is Liverpool, or it's a paper from Liverpool. A typical auction sale that you would have found in Britain in that period. And of course, in Britain in the 18th century, we're talking about probably maybe 20,000 Africans lived in various conditions of some in servitude and slavery, some free people, and I'll speak more about that in a moment. This is another typical feature of the 18th century, a reward notice for a runaway. You can read it for yourselves. This one is from an honest owner, because this owner actually says that his Negro man has run away, whereas others just put adverts saying lost, rather like people today put adverts for their cats or their dogs and so on. This is also very typical. You can see it's a London advert. And it shows us that Africans were liberating themselves, that they engaged in that activity. They weren't waiting for others to free them, they freed themselves. And people who were writing at the time who were in favor of human trafficking complained that when Africans came to Britain, they ran away, they organized themselves to run away, and other ordinary British people helped them to run away. Well, during that time, we also have, if you like, a growing movement of literate Africans writing in various ways. And their writing was very important because it undermined the racism that developed alongside slavery, the idea that Africans were inferior to Europeans. This is one of those famous writers. Her name was Phyllis Wheatley. She was actually born in what is today Senegal in West Africa, kidnapped and taken to Boston. Of course, Boston at that time was part of Britain. She was brought to London, where her poems were published in 1773, and this is an illustration of them. And she was famous in her day because she was an African woman poet. In fact, she was the first African woman ever to be published in English. And her poems are important, or some of them are important, because first of all, they undermine this idea that Africans were inferior, but some of them also talk about her condition of enslavement and so on. And they were used by people at the time to attack the institution of slavery, which existed in Britain and of course in the American colonies as well. This is another of those famous writers from that time, a man called Ottobah Cugoano, who again was formerly enslaved, managed to free himself, lived in London, and was one of the most active, we can say, political activists of that period, and one of the first to write a direct attack on slavery, which was published in 1787. Another was this man you probably heard of, Olaudah Equiano, excuse me, who was kidnapped at a young age as a child with his sister, separated from her and transported across the Atlantic. He then managed to buy his own freedom and became an abolitionist, a campaigner against human trafficking. And he wrote a best-selling autobiography that was translated into many other languages at the end of the 18th century. He was also, with Cugoano, a member of the Sons of Africa, which was a campaigning organization of Africans protesting against slavery and the slave trade, which was very important at that time. He was also involved with this organization, the London Corresponding Society, one of the political organizations of working people at that time, demanding rights for ordinary people. Of course, at that time, ordinary people in Britain had no rights to vote or anything else. And the London Corresponding Society is very interesting because its secretary, a man called Thomas Hardy, wrote explaining the views of the society. And he said that, he wrote to somebody and he said, if you are for the rights of Africans, you must also be for the rights of working people in Britain. And if you're for the rights of working people in Britain, you must also be for the rights of Africans. In other words, the London Corresponding Society was for the rights of all. And this was an idea which was rejected by the government of the day, and the London Corresponding Society was later banned. So people were actively organizing in this period against slavery and the slave trade. And in fact, one of the biggest political movements in Britain's history took place in the late 1780s, 1790s, involving millions of men, women, and children signing petitions, refusing to have sugar in their tea, and so on. It's usually left out of British history, but it's an extremely important movement. Some of those Africans in the 18th century were free people. Some were in the army, some were in the navy. This is just an illustration of one taken from the Queen's personal collection. I mentioned that I was giving a lecture tonight. She said, Hakim, you must take this picture and show the people. So this is quite unusual, a trumpeter in the household regiments. Very unusual, you would see such a person today. I mean, an African in the household regiments, but in the 18th century, this was not uncommon. Then we have this painting, again taken from this period. Interesting, not just because it's a picture of an African, but because no one's really sure who it is. 30 years ago, everybody said it was Equiano. Now people are not so sure, but it shows again the fact that Africans were very much part of British society in that period and were thought important enough to be painted by artists. Okay, I haven't spoken very much about women. So here is an illustration of a woman from the 18th century. This is Elizabeth Dido Lindsay. She's kind of interesting. I haven't got time to say too much about her, but she was the niece of the Lord Chief Justice of Britain, who actually played quite an important role in the whole question of slavery. But anyway, I haven't got time to go into it now. His name was Lord Chief Justice Mansfield, and she was his niece. So I'm moving into the 19th century. How are we doing for time? Okay, I'm going to speed up a bit. This guy's name was William Cuffy. He was one of the leaders of the London Chartists, a campaigner not only for the rights of workers, but also a campaigner against slavery and so on, and who was transported for his political activities in the 1840s. I'm going to speed up a little bit. Another famous figure from the 19th century, Mary Seacole, a Jamaican nurse, most famous for her activities during the Crimean War. at the same time as Florence Nightingale. And for many years, Florence Nightingale was, of course, very well known, Mary Seacole, relatively unknown, but much better known today. By the end of the 19th century, the colonial empire which Britain had was expanded with the invasion and division of the African continent, along with the other major European powers, until by the eve of the First World War, Africa was entirely divided between the major European powers, with just two exceptions. That scramble for African colonies also contributed to the First World War, and it led to a, what should we say, a reinforcement of racism. The idea that people of African heritage were unable to manage their own affairs, to govern themselves, and so on, which of course found its manifestations also in Britain. And it also led to a new movement developing called the Pan-African movement, meaning people of African heritage from different places getting together to campaign and speak with one voice for their rights. And one of those who took part in that early Pan-African movement was this good-looking young gentleman here. His name was Samuel Coleridge Taylor, born in Croydon in 1877. He was famous not for being a Pan-Africanist, which he was, but for being a classical composer. And in fact, one of Britain's most famous classical composers of that day. Unfortunately, he died at a very young age of 37. But you can still find his music for those who are interested. Well, here we have Walter Daniel Toll, not only famous for being one of the first black footballers and playing for Tottenham, which is a very good thing to do, but also because he was unusual in that he became one of the first black officers. In fact, he was probably the first British-born black officer in the British Army. At that time, there was a colour bar in British society, meaning that racism was legal. In other words, it wasn't illegal, and people could be discriminated against on the grounds of colour and nationality and background and so on. And the army was one of those institutions which discriminated against people. But during the First World War, in some instances, they lowered the colour bar, and Walter Toll was one of those admitted who became a lieutenant and was killed in action during the First World War. Of course, many others from Africa and the Caribbean, as well as from India and elsewhere, also contributed to that war. Perhaps more important were those who fought against the war, who became what are often called conscientious objectors. This gentleman, Isaac Hall from Jamaica, was one of those conscientious objectors who was imprisoned for his views, tortured, but never gave up his position and was eventually rescued. I think he was in Pentonville prison from memory. Often forgotten about, but a very important figure, because this war, despite what Michael Gove and others tell us, was a war between two gangs of robbers over how the world should be divided and redivided. Now, the racism that I talked about in this period was particularly noticeable after the First World War, when large-scale racist attacks broke out in about 9 cities and towns in Britain, including London, Manchester, Liverpool, Glasgow, Hull, and here we see in Cardiff. And these riots or racist attacks led to deaths. I suppose perhaps the most well-known of those was a man called Charles Wootton, who was from the Caribbean and had been in the Navy and was killed in Liverpool. But this problem of racism, which I haven't got time to go into explain in detail now, persisted throughout the 20th century, and particularly before 1965, when racism was first made illegal in Britain. Well, in response to colonialism in Africa, racism in Britain, we find that people from Africa and the Caribbean organizing themselves. This is one of those organizations, the West African Students' Union, formed in London in 1925. Here we see them with their patron, the famous African-American singer, actor, communist Paul Robeson. Another organization, the League of Colored Peoples, formed in 1931 specifically against racism, and here we see its regular publication from 1934. In the 1930s, African and Caribbean people in Britain, of course, organized also for other international issues, including the question of fascism and war. And here we see a demonstration from Cardiff, probably a demonstration of communists, because communism was a kind of popular political ideology at the time. And here you can see it's a demonstration against the Italian fascist invasion of Italy, but also for peace against the rise of fascism and the prospect of war. When war broke out in 1939, many people from Africa and the Caribbean came and volunteered to serve. Amongst them, this gentleman, Johnny Smythe, who joined the RAF from Sierra Leone. Of course, there are many others. But even during the war, there was a colour bar. And even people who were born in Britain, like Amelia King, were discriminated against and refused admittance to the land army. Of course, there are many other cases. I haven't got time to go into them now. Others during the war made their contribution as nurses. People often talk about nurses from the Caribbean, but of course there are many nurses from Africa, including this nurse. Her name was Adenrele Ademola. She was so famous that a film was made about her in 1943, which unfortunately has been lost. But there were many other African, Caribbean, and other nurses who were here during the war time period and leading to the beginnings of the NHS in 1948. 1945, the famous Manchester Pan-African Congress, one of the most famous meetings of African Caribbean people in, not just in British history, but in world history, demanding an end to colonial rule, as well as other demands. You can see here, concerned about what was going on in Palestine, anti-Semitism, and so on. The woman on the stage is a woman called Amy Ashwood Garvey, the first wife of Marcus Garvey, and she was a very important political activist here from the 1920s to the late 1950s. Well, here we come to 1948, where some people think this history began, and this is the arrival of the Empire Windrush, not the first ship to come from the Caribbean. In fact, the Empire Windrush was a ship taking people back to the Caribbean who were ex-servicemen, but then it kind of refilled on its way back. It was met by people who were already here. Here you can see Johnny Smythe, who I just mentioned a few moments ago, who's welcoming these guys. The government were very concerned about people coming in this way from the Caribbean, and in fact did everything they could to stop this ship arriving, did everything they could to put other people off, and so on and so forth. So when you hear that people were invited in the 1940s, it's not quite true. But again, time is against me going into it in more detail. The other thing that happened in 1948 is rather interesting, because 1948 is also the time when the colour bar in boxing was broken. Until 1948, if you were a black boxer, you could not fight for a British title. This gentleman broke that colour bar. His name was Dick Turpin. He was one of three brothers. He became British middleweight champion in 1948. His brother Randolph Turpin was even more famous. He became world middleweight champion, defeating some guy called Sugar Ray Robinson. Okay, he's a good looking young man, but I'm gonna pass over them because of time. So in the 1940s, 1950s, of course, more people came to Britain from Africa and the Caribbean because of the impoverishment of the colonies. There was mass unemployment in the Caribbean and also in Africa. When they came, they found all kinds of problems of racism, and so had to form organizations to fight for their rights. This is one of them, Afro-Caribbean organization in Birmingham, formed in the early 1950s. Another interesting organization from the 50s, the Committee of African Organizations, a coalition of African organizations in Britain that was responsible for starting the anti-apartheid movement in Britain. Another famous personality from that time, this is Claudia Jones, Trinidadian in origin, a communist, grew up in the US, member of the American Communist Party, was deported to Britain during the McCarthyite period in the US, where she became an important activist here. Here we see her leading a demonstration against the 1962 Immigration Act, one of the post-war openly racist immigration acts, which discriminated against people from what was called the New Commonwealth, meaning Africa, the Caribbean, and Asia. Claudia Jones also famous for initiating a Caribbean carnival in Britain in 1959, which became the Notting Hill Carnival. This guy's Paul Stevenson. He was one of those who involved in the Bristol bus boycott of 1963. At that time, the bus corporation in Bristol would not employ black conductors or bus drivers. They organized a campaign which smashed that color bar in 1963. Okay, moving into the 70s, because this is a kind of typical case, the Oval Four. Four young men who were attacked outside Oval Station in London by some men who turned out to be plainclothes police. They were all sentenced to imprisonment. Of course, people campaigned for many years. It wasn't until last year that Winston True, one of those four young men, finally was, his conviction was finally quashed when it was discovered belatedly that the police involved were entirely corrupt. In fact, the main police officer in the case ended up in prison himself many, many years ago. Anyway, Winston and the others have now been, whatever the word is, reprieved. Is that the right word? Anyway, pardoned or whatever. They're not pardoned. Their conviction has been completely quashed. But that attack on young black men was typical of the 1960s, 1970s. There are many other examples. And of course, people organized various, what we call kind of black power organizations like the Black Liberation Front in that time. That was formed in 1970, 1971. Then we move on to 1980s. Well, Black People's Day of Action, protesting about racism in general and the infamous New Cross fire, in which 13 young black people were killed, and nothing was done and nothing was said at that time. I remember being on that march myself. Seems like only yesterday. Okay, well, if we go into the 1990s, what can we say? Well, people probably remember the murder of Stephen Lawrence. It's become topical again because for two reasons. One, the Macpherson inquiry into what went on, into the police investigation, finally accepted the idea of institutional racism. Institutional racism was something first advanced in the 1960s by the Black Power movement in Britain and elsewhere. And it was finally recognized in the 1990s, so 30 years later. Of course, we now know that the police infiltrated the Lawrence family and did all kinds of terrible things. Okay, so this is 2010. This is my friend Aji and her son Olusheni, who again, unfortunately, was killed by the police in hospital. So the problems that young black men face at the hands of the police haven't finished, haven't concluded. There are many, many, many other examples. But obviously, as was said in the introduction, this is not an American phenomenon. This happens in Britain too. Well, I thought I'd say something about artists, cultural people. This is Buchi Emecheta, the famous Nigerian-born author who was living in Britain during this time, the 1970s, and died a few years ago, but was anyway a prominent author during this period. There are many, many others, no time to mention them all. Windrush affair, this is Paulette Wilson, who died a few weeks ago, was one of those victimized by the government under the so-called Windrush scandal. She was nearly deported by the Home Office, fought against her deportation, fought against the whole hostile environment, but unfortunately died. I think she died even before she'd been compensated by the Home Office, and very few people have been compensated as a result of that scandal. Bristol this year, okay, no time to say anything about that. That's it. So if people want to know more, this is a book I've written for young people, which will give you a very quick potted history of what I've been saying. this afternoon. That's it.